Lieutenant Colonel James Hartwell stood in a muddy field outside Pusan and stared at 3 acres of defeat. Broken radios stretched before him in ordered rows, thousands upon thousands of them, tagged and catalogued like corpses in a battlefield morgue. SCR-300 walkie-talkies with shattered cases. Vehicle-mounted SCR-193s with burnt-out tubes. Artillery observation radios with waterlogged circuits. Some had taken shrapnel, others had frozen solid in mountain positions, their components cracked by Korean winter cold. A few had simply worn out under conditions no peacetime engineer had imagined. The November wind carried the smell of cosmoline and rust. Hartwell did the math in his head. Each SCR-300 cost $375. Each vehicle radio ran $800. The specialized sets pushed past $2,000. He was looking at roughly $4.8 million in dead equipment, and more arrived daily on every supply truck from the front. The Korean War was 6 months old and already eating radios faster than Detroit could build them. "Sir, another convoy just pulled in," Captain Morris said behind him. 247 units, mostly walkie-talkies from the 2nd Infantry Division. They got chewed up pretty bad at Kunuri. Hartwell nodded without turning. The 2nd Infantry had fought through a Chinese roadblock that cost them 4,000 men. Nobody worried about saving radios when you're fighting for your life. You grabbed what worked and ran. The broken sets got left behind or smashed so the Chinese couldn't use them. Except the Chinese couldn't use them anyway. Most communist forces were still relying on field telephones and runners. Radio communication in the People's Liberation Army was limited to regimental level at best. The technological gap was staggering. America's problem was abundance. We had so many radios that losing hundreds didn't cripple operations. The Soviets equipped entire divisions with fewer sets than a single American regiment carried. But abundance created its own logistics nightmare. "What's the stateside estimate for repairs?" Hartwell asked. Morris consulted his clipboard. Signal Course Depot in New Jersey says 8 to 12 months turnaround. They are backlogged processing equipment from Japan and the Philippines. Figure another 4 months for shipping both ways. Realistically, anything we send back won't return to theater before late 1952. 2 years. These radios might as well be scrap metal. Hartwell walked between the rows, his boots squelching in mud. Some units looked pristine from the outside, their olive drab paint barely scratched. Internal failures probably. Vacuum tubes were fragile. The SCR-300's 19 tubes could fail from rough handling, temperature shock, or just bad luck. Other radios showed obvious trauma. Bullet holes, crushed cases, burn marks from electrical fires. A young corporal was cataloging new arrivals, copying serial numbers into a thick ledger. "How many are you processing daily?" Hartwell asked. "Yesterday was 312, sir. Today looks like more. 312 radios in a single day. At that rate, this junkyard would swallow a division's worth of equipment monthly." The American military was the most technologically sophisticated fighting force in human history, and it was drowning in its own complexity. Each infantry company needed radios to coordinate with battalion. Each battalion needed vehicle sets to talk to regiment. Artillery forward observers needed portable sets to call fire missions. Tank commanders needed intercoms and external radios. Air liaison officers needed specialized sets for close air support. Communication was everything. Without it, American firepower became uncoordinated chaos. The Pentagon had already diverted production to Korea. But even American industrial might had limits. Radio manufacturing was skilled work. You couldn't just retool a car factory and start stamping out vacuum tubes. Each SCR-300 required precision assembly by trained technicians. Wilkie Manufacturing in Indianapolis could produce about 2,000 units monthly. Galvin Manufacturing in Chicago added another 1,500. Other contractors filled gaps, but total production across all manufacturers topped out around 6,000 units monthly. The Korean War was burning through 4,000 radios every month, just in combat losses and irreparable damage. The math was brutal and getting worse. Hartwell paused beside a relatively intact SCR-300. Someone had tagged it, water damage, corrosion. He picked it up. Heavy. 38 pounds with batteries. The case felt solid. He opened the back panel and saw green oxidation crusting the tube sockets. Fixable, probably. Replace the tubes, clean the contacts, test the circuits. If you had trained technicians and parts in time. What percentage are we estimating as total losses? He asked. Morris flipped pages. Engineering assessment says maybe 40% are beyond economical repair. The rest are fixable with parts and labor. Problem is, we don't have either. Hartwell set the radio down carefully. 40% meant 60% could be saved. Roughly $3 million worth of equipment sitting here doing nothing while frontline units ran short. The war was already stretching American logistics in ways Korea's terrain seemed designed to maximize. The peninsula was a nightmare of mountains and narrow roads. Supply lines ran hundreds of miles from Pusan to frontline positions. Every truck carrying radio parts could have carried ammunition or rations or medical supplies instead. Priority went to things that kept men alive right now, not equipment that might be fixed eventually. A cold rain started falling, pattering on metal cases. Hartwell thought about his counterparts in the Chinese People's Liberation Army, facing this same Korean winter with equipment that made American surplus look sophisticated. Chinese infantry companies communicated with bugles and whistles. Their coordination came from rigid pre-battle planning and brutal discipline. When plans fell apart, and they always fell apart in combat, Chinese units fought isolated, each commander guessing at the larger battle. American squads had more communication capability than Chinese regiments, but that advantage died with the radios. And the radios were dying faster than America could replace them. Private Lee Jin-woo stood in the morning formation at POW Camp 7. Trying to ignore the cold penetrating his thin cotton uniform. 3 months as a prisoner had taught him that complaining achieved nothing. The Americans fed you adequately, didn't beat you, and left you alone if you caused no trouble. After 2 years in the North Korean People's Army, that counted as luxury. The guards called names for work details. Kitchen duty, latrine maintenance, camp cleanup. Lee had pulled all of them. Today felt like another day of meaningless labor designed to keep prisoners occupied and away from trouble. Then the American lieutenant called something different. Anyone here with radio or electrical experience? Lee's ears perked up. Before conscription, he'd been a radio operator in a signals battalion. The North Korean Army had trained him on Soviet-made sets, taught him Morse code, made him memorize frequency tables. Then they'd sent his unit into combat without enough radios to equip half the companies. Around him, other prisoners shifted. Admitting skills could be dangerous. Make yourself valuable to the Americans, and they might work you harder. Make yourself too valuable, and other prisoners would accuse you of collaboration. But Lee's curiosity overcame caution. He raised his hand. Name? The lieutenant asked through a Korean interpreter. Private Lee Jin-woo, Korean People's Army Signal Corps. The lieutenant made a note. You've operated military radios? Yes, sir. Model A7A, primarily. The Soviet copy of an American set, ironically. Also, telephone switchboards. Good. Report to the supply gate after breakfast. Lee spent the meal wondering what he'd volunteered for. The camp rumors said Americans sometimes flew prisoners to rear areas for intelligence interrogation. Others whispered about secret work details, though nobody knew details. The uncertainty gnawed at him. After breakfast, he joined 8 other prisoners at the gate. Guards loaded them into a truck and drove south toward Pusan proper. Through gaps in the canvas, Lee watched Korea's devastated landscape roll past. Villages reduced to rubble. Burnt-out tanks pushed to roadsides. Refugees trudging with everything they owned on their backs. This was the war he'd been told was liberating the South from American imperialism. The truck stopped at what looked like a supply depot. The prisoners climbed out and froze. Radios. Thousands of them. Organized in rows that stretched farther than Lee could see. More radios than existed in the entire North Korean army. An American sergeant approached, speaking through the interpreter. "These radios are broken. We need them fixed. Anyone who can repair them will work here instead of regular camp details. You'll receive technical manuals and parts. Your work will be inspected. Do good work, you stay. Do bad work, back to camp." Lee stared at the nearest radio. An SCR-300, American-made, the kind he'd been trained to capture and destroy. Its case was dented but intact. The problem tag read, "Intermittent transmission." The sergeant handed him a screwdriver. "Think you can fix that?" Every instinct screamed trap. They were giving enemy prisoners access to American military equipment, providing them with tools that could be weapons, offering technical manuals that revealed engineering secrets. This had to be a test. Fix it wrong and they'd accuse you of sabotage. Fix it right and they'd claim you were collaborating. Either way led to trouble. But Lee was an engineer at heart. The broken radio called to him like a puzzle demanding solution. He'd spent years working with inferior Soviet equipment, making do with missing parts and incomplete information. An American radio with proper tools and actual documentation? He took the screwdriver. The sergeant showed him to a work table under a canvas awning. Other prisoners were already there, radios open before them, looking as uncertain as Lee felt. Nobody spoke. Everyone understood that this moment balanced on a knife edge between opportunity and disaster. Lee opened the SCR-300's back panel. Inside was a world of American precision engineering. 19 vacuum tubes in neat rows. Color-coded wiring. Clean circuit layouts. Everything labeled and logical. Soviet radios were functional, but crude. North Korean equipment was Soviet gear assembled by undertrained workers. This American set was built like a watch, every component exactly where it should be. He touched nothing yet. First, observe, learn the system, understand the design. The intermittent transmission suggested a loose connection or failing tube. He traced the signal path from microphone input through amplification stages to the transmitter, checked solder joints, examined tube contacts, found a cracked solder point on the oscillator and resoldered it, restoring the circuit. The first radio Private Lee Jin-woo repaired came back to life at 0900 hours on a Tuesday morning in December 1951. Sergeant Davis, the American supervisor who'd been watching him work with barely concealed nervousness, reached over and turned the dial. Lee expected a frequency check, a simple carrier wave to verify transmission. Instead, what erupted from the speaker made him drop his soldering iron. A trumpet screamed through the static like nothing Lee had ever heard. Not the martial horns of North Korean military bands. Not the somber strings of approved revolutionary music. This was wild, improvisational, joyful, a sound that seemed to mock every rigid rule Lee had been taught about proper socialist art. "That's Dizzy Gillespie," Davis said, grinning. "Bebop. You like it?" Lee didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands were shaking. 3 other prisoners at the repair benches had stopped working entirely. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the radio as if it were transmitting secrets from another world. In a way, it was. For 5 years, North Korean propaganda officers had warned them about American degenerate music, evidence of capitalist decay, proof that Western culture was rotting from within. The pamphlets showed jazz musicians as race traitors and moral degenerates, their art a symptom of a dying society. But this didn't sound like decay. The complexity of the arrangement, the mathematical precision of the improvisation, the sheer technical skill required to make a trumpet dance like that, this was sophisticated beyond anything Lee's conservatory-trained ears could have imagined. And underneath it all was something even more dangerous. Freedom. Pure, unfiltered, contagious freedom. Kim Sung-ho, working 2 benches over, had frozen with a vacuum tube halfway to a socket. He was staring at the radio like it had just spoken Korean, which, in a way, it had. It was speaking the universal language of joy. "Back to work, gentlemen," Davis said, but he was still smiling. He left the radio on. That afternoon, Lee repaired 3 more SCR 300s. Each time, Davis tuned them to Armed Forces Radio Korea for testing. Each time, American music poured out. Louis Armstrong's gravelly voice, Benny Goodman's clarinet, Ella Fitzgerald singing with a technical precision and emotional depth that made Lee's chest ache. The North Korean commissars had taught them that American Negroes lived in chains, oppressed and suffering under racist capitalism. But Armstrong didn't sound oppressed. He sounded like the freest man on earth. By the end of that first week, something remarkable was happening in the repair tent. The work itself was transforming from reluctant compliance to genuine engagement. These weren't just enemy soldiers following orders under guard. These were engineers and technicians finally being allowed to use their minds. Corporal Kim Sung-ho had been an engineering student at Kim Il-sung University before conscription. The North Korean Army had made him a rifleman. In 3 years of service, not one officer had asked about his education. He'd been a number, a body to fill a uniform, a mouth that consumed rations. Now, American sergeants were asking him to diagnose intermittent signal degradation in ANPRC-10 radios. They were showing him technical manuals. They were treating him like his brain mattered. "You see the problem?" Davis asked one afternoon. Pointing at a schematic, Kim studied it. The circuit design was elegant, sophisticated beyond anything Soviet equipment used. "Capacitor is failing," he said in halting English. "Here, causing phase shift in oscillator." Davis beamed. "Exactly right. Fix it." No North Korean officer had ever said, "Exactly right," to Kim. Success in the People's Army meant you hadn't failed badly enough to be shot. There was no praise, no recognition, no acknowledgement that you'd done something well. But every time Kim fixed a radio correctly, Davis said, "Good work." Every time he solved a difficult problem, the Americans noticed. Within 2 weeks, Kim was training other prisoners in advanced troubleshooting techniques. The statistics coming out of the repair program were making officers in Pusan nervous for entirely different reasons than they'd expected. The POWs weren't just meeting repair quotas. They were exceeding them. By January 1952, the program was processing 2,000 radio units monthly with an 85% successful repair rate. Master Sergeant Donald Kleckner, brought in to oversee an expansion to a second facility, couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Half these guys have engineering degrees," he wrote in a report to Signal Corps headquarters. The communists had trained electrical engineers digging trenches and carrying ammunition. "It's the stupidest waste of talent I've ever seen." The American system was different. Find the skilled people, use their skills, reward competence. It seemed obvious, but in the rigid ideological hierarchies of communist armies, it was revolutionary. The music kept playing. Every radio had to be tested. Every test meant tuning to AFR Korea. And every broadcast was undermining years of propaganda more effectively than any leaflet drop or psychological warfare campaign. Private Lee Jin-woo found himself waiting for the evening broadcasts. AFR Korea ran a jazz program every night at 1900 hours. If he timed his repair work right, if he could make a radio come alive just before 7, he'd get to hear the whole show while completing the final checks. The American supervisors noticed. They didn't stop it. In fact, Sergeant Davis started leaving the radio on longer between repairs, letting the music fill the work tent. "You like this stuff?" Davis asked Lee one evening as Charlie Parker's saxophone wailed through a complex improvisation. Lee nodded slowly. He'd been composing a question in English for days, building up the courage to ask it. "This music? Very free?" Davis laughed. "Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Free. That's bebop, man. Charlie Parker doesn't play what anyone tells him to. He plays what he feels." The concept hit Lee like a physical force. Music that wasn't approved by a committee. Music that wasn't designed to instill proper revolutionary consciousness. Music that existed purely because someone felt like creating it. That was American culture in a nutshell, though Lee didn't have the vocabulary to express it yet. Create what you want. Think what you want. Be what you want. The chaos they'd been warned about wasn't chaos at all. It was freedom. And freedom was more sophisticated than any central planning could ever be. By February, the repair tent had waiting lists. POWs were volunteering for radio maintenance duty in numbers that made camp administrators suspicious. They interrogated prisoners looking for evidence of a conspiracy or escape plan. What they found was simpler and more profound. Men wanted meaningful work. They wanted to use their minds. They wanted to hear American music. Kim Sung-ho was blunt when questioned. "I was engineer," he told the camp intelligence officer through an interpreter. "For 3 years, I carry rifle. Now, I fix radio. I do what I trained to do. Why would I not volunteer?" The intelligence report noted dryly, "Subject appears motivated primarily by professional satisfaction and access to armed forces radio broadcasts. No evidence of coercion or conspiracy detected. No evidence of conspiracy. Just the magnetic power of treating people like human beings." Private First Class Park Chul-soo had resisted for weeks. A committed communist from a family of party loyalists, he'd refused all work assignments on ideological grounds. American officers hadn't forced him. They'd simply assigned him to a tent adjacent to the repair facility. Park lasted 9 days. 9 days of hearing other prisoners engaged in technical discussions. 9 days of music drifting through canvas walls. 9 days of watching men treated with respect for competent work. On the 10th day, he approached Sergeant Kleckner and said in carefully practiced English, "I can repair radio. I volunteer." Kleckner didn't gloat, didn't lecture, just handed him a screwdriver and said, "Let's see what you can do." Park became one of the program's most skilled technicians. 6 months later, when repatriation discussions began, he requested asylum in South Korea. His debriefing statement contained one sentence that U.S. intelligence circulated all the way to Washington. "I learned more about human dignity in 3 months fixing American radios than in 3 years learning to build socialism." That was the real victory, not the 47,000 radios ultimately repaired, not the $18 million saved, not even the 0 sabotage incidents and 3% defect rate that beat civilian contractors. The victory was in the conversions, in the minds changed, in the realization that spread through the camps like wildfire. Everything the commissars had taught them was a lie. America wasn't decaying. America was abundant. America didn't crush individual talent. It celebrated it. American Negroes weren't oppressed victims. They were creating the most sophisticated art on the planet. American chaos wasn't weakness. It was the sound of freedom improvising in real time. And jazz, that degenerate music, was proving more effective than any propaganda campaign the U.S. government could have designed. The radios kept coming. The prisoners kept fixing them. And every time a unit crackled to life, tuned to Armed Forces Radio Korea, another crack appeared in the ideological foundation of communism. Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet was winning the Cold War, one repaired, walkie-talkie at a time. Senior Sergeant Park Min-soo sat cross-legged in his tent, arms folded, jaw clenched. The Americans wanted him to betray everything he'd learned in 3 years at Moscow's Radio Technical Institute. They wanted him to use his education, paid for by the People's Republic, refined by Soviet instructors, to repair imperialist war machines. Not a chance. Park was no ordinary prisoner. He'd studied under Professor Volkov himself, mastering frequency modulation theory, while his classmates back in Pyongyang were still learning basic circuitry. The Communist Party had invested in him, trusted him, elevated him. His loyalty wasn't for sale, but the Americans hadn't tried to buy it. That was the problem. Through the canvas walls, Park heard Corporal Kim explaining transformer calculations to a group of prisoners. Kim's voice carried the patient tone of a natural teacher, breaking down complex concepts into digestible pieces. Park recognized the satisfaction in that voice, the joy of sharing knowledge, of watching understanding dawn in someone's eyes. The North Korean army had never let Kim teach anyone anything. They'd made him a radio operator and threatened execution if he spoke without permission. Then came the other sound. That cursed American music. Someone had tuned a test radio to Armed Forces Radio Korea again. Duke Ellington's orchestra was working through Take the A Train, and the complexity made Park's engineering mind rebel against his ideological training. This wasn't supposed to be sophisticated. Capitalist culture was supposed to be simple, crude, designed to narcotize the masses. But the arrangement demonstrated mathematical precision in its improvisation. The horn section's harmonics showed deliberate acoustic engineering. The piano solo revealed someone who understood music theory at a level that rivaled Park's understanding of radio theory. 4 days. He'd lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, Park Min-soo walked to the repair tent and told Sergeant Davis he was ready to work. Davis didn't gloat, didn't lecture, just handed Park a damaged ANPRC EM-10 and a technical manual translated into Korean. "Receiver's dead," Davis said. "Think you can find the problem?" Park could find it in his sleep. He'd worked on Soviet radios built on nearly identical principles. The American version showed better component quality, tighter tolerance capacitors, cleaner solder joints, but the fundamental architecture was familiar. 20 minutes later, he'd traced the fault to a burned-out tube in the intermediate frequency stage. He replaced it, aligned the receiver, and powered up the unit. Duke Ellington poured out of the speaker mid-song. Park's hands froze on the tuning dial. He'd intended to switch to a military frequency for proper testing, but the music held him paralyzed. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was free. Every note was a choice, not an order. Every musician was contributing individually while serving the collective whole. Exactly what socialism promised and never delivered. "Good work," Davis said. The sergeant marked something on his clipboard. "You've got skills the others don't. Interested in training a few men on intermediate frequency alignment? It's our biggest bottleneck. Training, not just working, but teaching. Using his Moscow education to help people learn, not just to maintain equipment for commissars who'd shoot him for the slightest mistake." Park heard himself say yes. Within a week, he was running his own corner of the repair facility. 8 prisoners worked under his supervision, and Park discovered something that 3 years of communist education had never mentioned. He was good with people. He could explain why a circuit worked, not just that it worked. He could encourage without threatening. He could watch mediocre technicians become skilled craftsmen under patient guidance. The Americans let him do this, encouraged it even. Captain Morrison visited the facility and complimented Park's teaching methods. Master Sergeant Kleckner brought him advanced manuals on FM theory for recreational reading. Recreational reading. As if learning was something you could do for pleasure, not just duty. The numbers told their own story. By February 1952, the POW repair program was processing 2,400 radios monthly. Park's team alone handled 300 units, specializing in the complex receiver alignments that stumped less experienced technicians. Their defect rate sat at 1.8%, lower than the Army's depot in Yokohama. But Park's real transformation came during a conversation with Private Lee Jin-woo, the first prisoner to join the program. They were testing a batch of repaired SCR 300s, and AFR Korea was broadcasting a Dizzy Gillespie set that had both men momentarily distracted. "You know what I realized?" Lee said, adjusting a squelch control. The propaganda wasn't entirely wrong. America does have problems, but they argue about them in public, on the radio. They argue about race, about economics, about everything. And nobody gets shot for having the wrong opinion. Park had noticed this too. The AFR broadcasts included news reports that mentioned American struggles, labor disputes, political debates, social tensions. The kind of things that would never be admitted in North Korean broadcasts, where every day brought glorious victories and perfect unity. "In Moscow," Park said slowly, "we were taught that capitalist freedom was chaos. that societies need firm guidance from those who understand history's laws. And now? Park gestured at the repair facility around them. 80 prisoners working efficiently, learning complex skills, taking pride in their output. No political officers watching for deviation. No quotas backed by death threats. Just Americans who provided manuals, tools, and respect. Now I think chaos looks a lot like jazz, Park said. Everyone improvising, but it works, because they're all skilled enough to contribute something meaningful. Lee grinned. You should tell that to the interrogators. They keep asking why we work so hard. The American intelligence officers had been puzzled by the program's success. They'd expected adequate work motivated by extra rations. Instead, they got excellence motivated by something harder to quantify. The simple human need to use your skills for something that mattered. Park had tried explaining this during his latest debriefing. In the North Korean army, he'd told Lieutenant Morrison, I maintained radios for officers who didn't understand them and didn't care to learn. If equipment failed, I was blamed. If it worked, nobody noticed. Here, when I fix a radio, someone thanks me. When I teach someone, they appreciate it. This isn't complicated. But it was revolutionary. The entire communist system rested on the assumption that people needed to be forced to work, that without the threat of punishment and promise of reward from the state, human beings would choose laziness. 3 months of fixing American radios had demolished that assumption. Park's complete conversion came in April 1952. AFR Korea was broadcasting a program about American manufacturing, and the statistics seemed impossible. One factory, Willow Run in Michigan, had produced 8,685 B-24 bombers during the war. Not just produced, built them at a rate of 1 aircraft every 63 minutes. Park did the math automatically. That was faster than North Korean factories could build bicycles. The broadcast continued with similar incomprehensible numbers. American shipyards launched carriers in 17 months. American arsenals produced more ammunition in 1 year than Germany managed in 6. American farms grew so much food that the country was shipping millions of tons overseas as aid. This wasn't propaganda designed to demoralize enemies. This was information for American citizens, delivered in the same casual tone as weather reports. Park sat very still, listening to his worldview crumble. The Soviet Union had won World War II, he'd been taught, through superior ideology and heroic sacrifice. The capitalist Americans had merely shipped some supplies and claimed credit, but these numbers told a different story. They revealed a production capacity so vast it seemed like fantasy. An industrial base so powerful it had literally outbuilt the entire Axis alliance while maintaining the highest standard of living on Earth. And the Americans didn't just build weapons. They built radios complex enough that repairing them required genuine skill. They built systems efficient enough that trusting enemy prisoners with sensitive equipment made economic sense. They built a culture confident enough to broadcast jazz to the world and let the music speak for itself. Sergeant Park? One of his students interrupted his thoughts. This coupling capacitor keeps failing. Should we try a different value? Park examined the problem, suggested a solution, watched the young man's face light up with understanding. This interaction, teacher and student, problem and solution, effort and appreciation, represented everything Moscow had promised and America had delivered. That evening, Park requested a meeting with Captain Morrison. The next morning, he formally petitioned for asylum in South Korea. His defection report was brief, but one line captured everything. I spent 3 years learning to build socialism. I learned more about human dignity in 3 months fixing American radios. The report didn't mention that he'd also learned to love bebop, though his personnel file noted a standing request for any technical manuals on FM radio theory, and a curious habit of humming Duke Ellington while working. By June 1952, 43 other prisoners had followed Park's example, choosing South Korea over repatriation. American intelligence officers tried to quantify what had changed these men's minds. Was it the food? The working conditions? The absence of political indoctrination? Sergeant Davis understood better. He'd watched Park transform from sullen ideologue to enthusiastic teacher, and he'd seen the pattern repeat dozens of times. "You can't fake what happens in this tent," Davis told his superiors. "These men discover they're good at something, that people value their skills, that learning is satisfying. Then they hear music that celebrates individual excellence while creating collective beauty. That combination breaks through propaganda like nothing else." The radio repair program had become America's most effective recruiting tool, and it ran on nothing but technical manuals, replacement parts, and jazz. The frozen hillside erupted with machine gun fire. Second Lieutenant Robert Chen pressed himself against Korean granite while rounds chewed through the air 3 feet above his head. His platoon was pinned, outnumbered, and dangerously exposed. They needed close air support in the next 5 minutes, or they'd be overrun. Chen grabbed the SCR-300 strapped to his radio man's back. 2 weeks ago, this exact radio sat broken in a warehouse in Pusan. Now, when Chen keyed the mic, his voice transmitted crisp and clear to a forward air controller circling overhead in an L-19 observation plane. 4 minutes later, a pair of F-51 Mustangs screamed over the ridgeline, their .50 caliber guns tearing into Chinese positions. Chen's platoon survived because a North Korean POW named Lee Jin-woo had replaced a cracked crystal oscillator and resoldered connection points with a precision that exceeded factory specifications. This was happening across the entire Korean peninsula. The communications backbone, sustaining 300,000 UN forces, was being maintained by enemy soldiers, an industrial operation running on pure American trust. By March 1952, the POW radio repair program had expanded to 7 facilities processing 3,400 units monthly. Over 800 North Korean prisoners were handling the most sensitive communications equipment in the U.S. arsenal. They repaired SCR-300 infantry radios that coordinated assaults. They serviced ANPR-C-10 sets that transmitted artillery coordinates. They maintained battalion-level ANGRC-9 radios containing frequency crystals and technical specifications that communist intelligence would have killed to obtain. American officers didn't just allow this. They encouraged it. They provided technical manuals translated into Korean. They established training programs where POW master technicians taught advanced troubleshooting to other prisoners. They created merit systems where the best workers earned privileges, extra rations, recreation time, and yes, unlimited access to armed forces radio broadcasts. Master Sergeant Donald Kleckner supervised the largest facility near Taegu. His operation employed 187 POWs working 3 shifts around the clock. The men processed everything from simple antenna repairs to complete circuit board reconstruction. Their repair success rate hit 87% in March, higher than the Army Signal Corps depot in Yokohama. The defect rate dropped to 2.1%, better than civilian contractors stateside. "These guys take ownership," Kleckner wrote in his monthly report. Yesterday, Private Song stayed 4 hours past his shift tracking down an intermittent short in a VRC-3 vehicular radio. Nobody ordered him to. He just wouldn't quit until he found it. That's not compliance, that's pride. The financial impact was staggering. Each repaired radio represented $380 in saved replacement costs, $120 in avoided shipping expenses, and months of eliminated procurement delays. By conservative estimates, the program saved the U.S. military $847,000 monthly, over $10 million annually in 1952 dollars. That's roughly $120 million today. But the numbers only told half the story. The real miracle was the transformation happening inside the repair tents. Corporal Kim Sung-ho, the engineering student who'd first heard Dizzy Gillespie through a test radio, now supervised a 12-man team specializing in frequency modulation systems. His team had achieved something remarkable. They'd identified a design flaw in the SCR-300 that caused crystal drift in extreme cold. Working with American engineers, Kim developed a modification using additional insulation around the oscillator housing. The field modification reduced cold weather failures by 34%. An enemy prisoner had improved American military equipment. The modification was officially adopted and implemented across frontline units. Kim's smarter than half our Signal Corps officers, Captain Morrison admitted. He understands radio theory at a level most Americans never reach. The North Koreans had him digging trenches. We gave him test equipment and technical manuals. That's the difference between their system and ours. The cultural transformation deepened daily. What had started with jazz broadcasts had evolved into something more profound. The POWs weren't just hearing American music. They were experiencing American abundance, American innovation, American values in action. Private Lee Jin-woo, who'd repaired his first radio 5 months earlier, had become the program's star technician. His personnel file documented 427 completed repairs with a 0.7% defect rate. He'd requested and received advanced manuals on FM theory, super heterodyne receiver design, and vacuum tube characteristics. He studied during his off hours, teaching himself concepts that hadn't existed in North Korean technical education. In my country, asking questions meant you doubted the party, Lee told intelligence officers during a routine debriefing. Here, Sergeant Davis gets excited when I ask questions. He brings me books. Yesterday he found a manual on radar theory just because I asked about it. That's not normal. That's not how militaries work, except this one. The interrogation reports made fascinating reading. Over 60% of POWs working in the repair program now expressed doubts about communist ideology. They weren't being propagandized or coerced. They were simply being treated like competent professionals. And that experience was destroying years of indoctrination more effectively than any pamphlet campaign. Senior Sergeant Park Min-soo, the former zealot who'd defected in April, had become an intelligence asset of incalculable value. His technical knowledge of Soviet training methods helped American engineers understand communist communications doctrine. But more valuable were his insights into the psychological impact of the program. Every radio we fix is a message, Park explained during a debriefing. It says, "We trust you with our most important technology." In North Korea, nobody trusts anybody. Commissars watch officers. Officers watch soldiers. Soldiers inform on each other. The idea that Americans would hand us their radios, teach us their secrets, then leave us unsupervised, it's incomprehensible. It proves everything we were taught about capitalism was a lie. By June 1952, the program had generated 43 formal defection requests. Each POW cited the same factors: meaningful work, respectful treatment, technical education, and exposure to American culture through radio broadcasts. The defection rate among radio repair workers was 7 times higher than the general POW population. American intelligence recognized they'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. This wasn't just cost-effective logistics. It was psychological warfare of devastating effectiveness. Every POW who chose South Korea over repatriation was a propaganda victory more powerful than 1,000 leaflets. These men had lived under communism, fought for it, then experienced the American alternative. Their choice spoke louder than any official statement. The program's scope kept expanding. By autumn 1952, POW technicians were handling 92% of all radio repairs in the Korean theater. They'd processed over 47,000 units, more equipment than the entire North Korean military possessed at the war's start. The saved costs exceeded $18 million. 0 instances of sabotage had been documented. Not one. Colonel James Tarkington visited the Taegu facility in October. He watched POW technicians bent over workbenches, test equipment glowing, soldering irons in hand, jazz drifting from a dozen radios undergoing signal checks. These were enemy soldiers maintaining the communications network that was defeating their own army. "This only works because we're Americans," Tarkington wrote in his after-action report. The Soviets would assume sabotage and shoot everyone. The Chinese would see ideological contamination and establish commissar oversight that would destroy efficiency. We see human potential and give people a chance to use it. That's why they're fixing our radios instead of sabotaging them. That's why they're requesting asylum instead of counting days until repatriation. That's why we win. The repair tent had become a laboratory for cultural conversion. The music still played constantly. Charlie Parker, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday. But the transformation ran deeper than jazz. It was in the way Sergeant Davis said, "Good work," when a repair met standards. It was in the technical manuals provided without restriction. It was in the merit system that rewarded skill instead of political loyalty. It was in the simple, revolutionary fact that these men were trusted with America's most vital technology, and they'd proven worthy of that trust. Private Song, who'd stayed late tracking down that intermittent short, had requested asylum in August. His petition included a line that perfectly captured the program's impact. "I wanted to live in a country where staying late to fix a radio is appreciated instead of suspected." By war's end, over 40% of POWs who'd worked in radio repair chose South Korea over repatriation. That's 320 men who'd experienced both systems and voted with their lives for the American way. Each one became a walking testament to the power of freedom, respect, and opportunity. Major General William Dean, who'd endured brutal North Korean captivity and knew firsthand how communists treated prisoners, reviewed the program's final statistics with something approaching awe. 47,000 radios repaired, $18 million saved, 0 sabotage, hundreds of conversions, all achieved by trusting enemy soldiers with sophisticated military technology and treating them like human beings instead of numbers. "This is why we win," Dean wrote. "Not because we have better weapons, though we do. Not because we have more courage. Courage is universal. We win because we understand that human beings want to contribute something meaningful, and we give them that chance. Even our enemies." The Korean POW radio repair program achieved something no other military in history could have accomplished. It combined American pragmatism with American values, solving a logistics crisis while winning hearts and minds through the simple act of treating people with dignity. The Soviets had superior intelligence networks, but would never have trusted prisoners with anything valuable. The Chinese had numerical superiority, but lacked the technical sophistication. The North Koreans had ideological fervor, but created systems where talent withered and innovation invited suspicion. Only America could hand enemy soldiers sophisticated military equipment, teach them its secrets, then trust them to repair it properly while listening to Dizzy Gillespie. Only a nation built on human potential instead of rigid hierarchy could turn POW labor into industrial-scale success. Only a culture confident in its own appeal could expose communist prisoners to American broadcasts and know they'd become converts instead of saboteurs. The program didn't just fix radios, it demonstrated civilizational superiority in the most fundamental way possible, by proving that freedom works better than coercion, that trust produces better results than suspicion, that treating people with respect generates loyalty propaganda can never match. Somewhere on a frozen Korean hillside, an American infantry platoon called in perfect air support through a radio that had been junk 6 weeks earlier. The repair saved lives and symbolized the broader victory. Trust and dignity could win where coercion failed.